My grandfather was always a strong presence in my life. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice when he passed away. I felt like a piece of my world crumbled. Visiting his grave became a ritual for me, a way to stay connected to the man who had taught me so much. The cemetery where he was buried wasn't far from my home. It was an old place with towering oak trees and weathered headstones that leaned slightly as if bowing to time. The paths were narrow, winding through the graves in a way that felt almost intentional, like they were guiding you through the memories of the people who rested there. I visited, often always bringing fresh flowers to place at his headstone. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought. One evening just before sunset, I decided to visit my grandfather's grave. The sky was a dull orange, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the center cemetery. The air was cool, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves above. As I walked along the familiar path, I noticed how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps on the gravel. I reached my grandfather's grave and stood there for a while, lost in thought. The headstone was simple, just like the man it marked. I placed the flowers at its base and said a few words, my voice barely above a whisper. As the shadows grew longer, I felt a chill creep up my spine. But I brushed it off as the cooling evening air with a final look at the headstone. I turned and made my way back to my car. Just as I reached the cemetery gates, my phone rang. The sound was startling. In the silence, and I fumbled for a moment before pulling it out of my pocket. The screen showed an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then a voice spoke low and familiar. It was my grandfather's voice. "Why did you leave so soon?" He asked the words slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be him. It wasn't possible. He was gone. I knew that, but the voice on the other end of the line was unmistakably his, so intense that I nearly dropped the phone. "Who is this?" I stammered, but there was no response. The line went dead, leaving only the faint sound of the wind through the trees. I stood there, phone still in hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the cemetery gate for support. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be a prank, someone with a sick sense of humor. The voice had been too real, too familiar. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The memory of that voice haunted me, echoing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Despite my fear, I knew I had to go back to the cemetery. I needed to see my grandfather's grave to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The sun was bright that day, casting sharp shadows across the ground as I walked the now familiar path. Everything looked the same as it always had. The trees, the headstones, the narrow paths winding through the graves. But something felt different, an unease that I couldn't quite place. As I approached my grandfather's grave, I stopped in my tracks there a few feet away from the headstone. Stood a figure. It was my grandfather. He looked just as he had when he was alive, dressed in his usual clothes, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, and my breath caught in my throat. A chill ran down my spine, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. My mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But my body refused to obey. Then, slowly, my grandfather's face began to change. His skin grew pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a grimace that was nothing Like the gentle smile I remembered it was as if I was looking at a reflection of him distorted and wrong. The figure took a step toward me, and that was when I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The path blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the gate. My heart pounding in my ears, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, trying to hold me back, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear that gripped me was stronger than anything I had ever felt. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands trembling. I sat there for a long time, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes fixed on the cemetery gate. I half expected to see the figure standing there watching me, but the gate remained empty. I never went back to that cemetery. I couldn't. Whatever I saw that day, whatever called me on that phone, it wasn't my grandfather. It was something else, something that should never have been disturbed. The memory of that day still haunts.